Hey, I wanted to leave a few words on a framework that can be helpful in understanding the differences between the what's often called the big three moral theories in the history of moral philosophy. These would be virtue theory from Aristotle, utilitarianism from John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, and deontology from Immanuel Kant. Those have been the biggest three players in the history of moral philosophy. And one way that we can kind of plot their differences and understand some kind of fundamental intuitions that lead to different principles and frameworks of moral evaluation is basically where they locate moral worth. Each theory will have some guiding intuition about which component of human action is the one that bears the moral worth of the action, or that determines the moral worth, moral status, or moral standing of the action. So let me back up a little bit. Actions are arguably the primary object of moral evaluation. We may also evaluate other things, institutions, processes, social structures, but certainly a human action is one of the, if not the, main object of moral evaluation. It's the thing whose moral status we want to determine with a moral theory. And a moral theory should give us some principle for making that kind of judgment, and of course arguments for why that should be the principle that we should use to render judgment on the moral status of an action. And there, as far as arguments why, we note first that actions have different elements, aspects, or components to them. Let's say this is really very broad. At the very least, we can speak of a motive, the act itself, and the consequence of the action. The picture being that every action is caused by a motivation or an intention inside of you. There's the set of behaviors that constitute the action itself. And of course, there are the consequences of the action in the world at large, other people, the environment, and so on. So it seems like we can distinguish at least these three main components: motive, the action itself, and the consequences of the action. Now, of course, each one of these is itself a very complex thing of its own, but let's leave aside those kinds of complexities. One thing that we see is that different philosophers have identified each of these three different components of action as the one that determines the moral status of the act as a whole, or we might say as the one, let me say it this way, as the place where the moral value of the action resides. So for example, Kant will say that the moral status of an action is determined wholly by the moral status of the motive component of the action, not by the consequences. So Kant is going to say it's the motive component of action that determines its worth. Now looking at the other wing of it, John Stuart Mill is going to say it's the consequence of the action that determines its moral worth, not the motive component. The moral status of the action is determined entirely by the action's consequences. So we can see in these cases, Mill and Kant are locating the moral worth of the action in different components of the action. The motive component, the consequence component. Aristotle, we would say, locates the moral worth of the action really in the act itself. What matters is the type or kind of act that a given action is. For him, it won't just be being an act of virtue, but rather being an act from virtue, which means that the action itself has to kind of contain or at least come from the virtue in the agent. And that's a feature of the action itself. And good actions are ones where the action itself is of that type or kind. So we can see the big three each locate moral worth in a different component or aspect of action as a whole. And that's a pretty interesting framework through which we can see these very different principles of moral evaluation and the kind of guiding intuition which leads different philosophers into these different directions includes where they locate moral worth in human action. So that's an interesting thing to think about. In some cases, maybe it won't matter. Torturing innocent people typically has bad consequences, probably would count as a vicious act for Aristotle, and presumably would not be well motivated or count as a good motive, according to Kant. So sometimes maybe this disagreement about where the moral worth lies doesn't matter. However, sometimes it definitely will. We can certainly think of well-motivated actions that have bad consequences, or ill-motivated actions that have good consequences, and there, Kant and Mill, at least, will have a disagreement. And I guess in order to know which judgment of the action is right, we're going to have to come up with some position on who's right about the location of moral value. Okay, so I just wanted to give that little overview. It can be just kind of a helpful way to organize the big three, and they all have different principles of moral evaluation, and we can kind of understand those separately from what I've been discussing here, but we can also see these different principles of moral evaluation as growing out of divergent intuitions about where moral value lives. Okay? Take it easy.